There is a belief most people carry without examining it. That family is the one place where betrayal cannot reach. That blood is a contract written before language existed, before law existed, before any institution had the authority to define what one person owes another. That the people who share your name, your childhood, your first memories, those people are the ones who will hold the line when everything else fails. Most people carry that belief their entire lives and never have it tested. Thomas Greer had it tested in a hospital bed. He was unconscious when it happened, coming out of a 3-hour surgery, 1 kidney lighter, 1 brother richer, and a family home that would be sold before he could walk to the bathroom on his own. By the time Thomas understood what had occurred, the money was gone. His brother was gone. And the house where he had grown up, where his mother had cooked Sunday dinners for 30 years, where his children had taken their first steps, where a family's entire accumulated history lived in the walls and floors and a backyard with an oak tree his father had planted the year Thomas was born. That house belonged to strangers. He had given his brother a kidney. His brother had taken everything else. He had signed the surgery consent forms. He had signed the power of attorney. He had said yes without hesitation, without conditions, without the thought that trust requires protection. He had been the kind of brother that most people only pretend to be. And while he lay in a recovery ward, sedated and monitored, and reduced to the most vulnerable version of himself a human being can occupy, his brother was on the phone with a real estate attorney. This is not a story about crime, though crime lives inside it. This is not a story about the law, though the law spent 8 years trying to address it. This is a story about what it costs to be the person who gives without calculating, about the specific violence of a betrayal that was planned in the weeks before a surgery that saved the betrayer's life. This is the story of Thomas Greer, and this is an untold wrong. Thomas Greer was born in 1968 in Cleveland, Ohio. He was the second of 3 children in a household that operated on the specific economy of working-class stability, where everything was possible through effort. Nothing was guaranteed without it, and the difference between comfort and hardship was a single bad year. His father, Raymond, worked the Norfolk Southern Railroad for 31 years, the kind of work that ages a man's hands before his face, that comes home in the body at the end of every shift as accumulated weight. Raymond Greer was not an expressive man. He showed love through presence and provision, through the mortgage paid on time, through the car that started every morning, through a backyard maintained with a precision that said, "This place matters to me," without ever using those words. His mother, Evelyn, worked everything else. She was a school secretary for 20 years and a part-time bookkeeper for a local church for 15. She was the one who knew every neighbor's name and remembered every birthday, and made the house on Mercer Street into the kind of place that people wanted to return to. Her children brought friends home, not because the house was large or impressive, but because something in its atmosphere communicated that you were welcome, that food would appear, that the conversation would last as long as you needed it to. Thomas's older sister, Sandra, left for Ohio State at 18 and built a life in Columbus. The departure was gradual and then permanent. The way distance works when 2 people develop different orbits. She remained present for holidays and crises, but the intimacy of shared daily life faded quickly and never fully returned. Thomas understood this without resentment. Sandra had found her place. That was allowed. His younger brother Daniel was born 4 years after Thomas, in 1972. He arrived small and loud and immediately the center of every room. From the beginning, Daniel had a quality that is difficult to describe without making it sound either charming or dangerous. And the honest answer is that it was both simultaneously. He was the kind of person who made you feel, when you were with him, that you were the most important person in his world, that the conversation you were having was the one he had been waiting to have, that his attention, when it was on you, was complete. The problem with that quality is what happens when the attention moves. Thomas understood this about his brother by the time they were teenagers. He understood that Daniel's warmth was real, but not consistent, that the closeness he offered was genuine in the moment, and then simply absent, not maliciously, not through deception. Daniel did not wake up each morning deciding who to charm and who to discard. He simply moved through the world in response to immediate stimulation, and the people who were not in front of him ceased, for practical purposes, to exist. Thomas found this painful for a while, and then found a way to accommodate it. He loved Daniel on Daniel's terms. He accepted the gap between what his brother could offer and what a relationship between brothers should theoretically contain. He built his expectations around the reality rather than the ideal. This accommodation, this practiced tolerance of his brother's limitations, would become the foundation of the betrayal. Because you cannot be exploited by a stranger in the same way you can be exploited by someone whose limitations you have already accepted as the price of the relationship. Thomas graduated from Garfield High School in 1986. He attended Cleveland State University on a partial scholarship, studied accounting, graduated in 1990, and returned to Cleveland. He took a position with a mid-sized manufacturing firm called Barton Industrial, where he would work for the next 22 years. He married Patricia Holloway in 1993. Their son Marcus was born in 1996, and their daughter Renee in 1999. The life Thomas built was deliberate and unglamorous, in the best possible sense of that word. He was present. He was reliable. He coached his son's baseball team for 6 years. He drove his daughter to swim practice at 5:30 a.m. 3 mornings a week for 4 years. He called his mother every Sunday without exception from the day he left for college until the Sunday after her funeral, when there was no one to call. He paid down the mortgage on a house 2 miles from Mercer Street with the systematic determination of a man who understood that security is not given. It is built, payment by payment, over decades. Daniel's life looked different, not disastrously so, not in ways that would have alarmed a casual observer. He graduated from Cleveland State 2 years after Thomas, worked in sales for a software company in Columbus for 3 years, then moved to Chicago, then to Denver, then to Atlanta. Each move came with a new opportunity that sounded promising. Each departure came with a clean exit from whatever he had been building. He borrowed money from Thomas twice. The first time was in 2001, $4,000 for a security deposit on an apartment in Denver. He repaid it in 6 months. The second time was in 2007, $7,500 to cover a gap between jobs during the early months of the financial crisis. He repaid that too, in full, over 8 months of small transfers. These repayments established a pattern in Thomas's mind that functioned as evidence of character. The money had come back. Therefore, Daniel was trustworthy in financial matters. This was the second foundation stone of the betrayal. Trust established through small transactions, cultivated over years to make a larger transaction possible. In 2009, Evelyn Greer died of a stroke. She was 71 years old. She had lived in the house on Mercer Street for 34 years. She died in the bedroom at the end of the hall on a Tuesday afternoon in November, with Thomas beside her. Her will divided the house equally between Thomas and Daniel, her two sons. Sandra received a different portion of the estate. The house went to both of them. Thomas had no interest in selling. The house was 2 miles from his own home. His mother had died in it. His children knew it as the place where their grandmother lived, where the smell of the kitchen was a specific thing they had grown up associating with safety and comfort. Selling it felt like a second death, the institutional erasure of what Evelyn Greer had built. Daniel agreed readily to the arrangement. Thomas would maintain the property. Daniel held his half share. When the time came to sell, they would discuss it and divide the proceeds equally. There was no formal agreement. It was a conversation between brothers, conducted at their mother's kitchen table 3 weeks after her funeral. It did not occur to Thomas that it needed to be anything more than that. Daniel understood this. He understood the value Thomas placed on the house. He understood that Thomas would not sell voluntarily, would not apply pressure, would not push for his share. He understood that the house was the kind of thing Thomas would protect indefinitely, which meant that the only way to access the asset was to act when Thomas could not prevent it. He filed that calculation away for 5 years. In 2014, Daniel Greer was diagnosed with end-stage renal disease, both kidneys failing. He was 42 years old. He went on dialysis 3 times a week, 4 hours per session, attached to a machine that did the work his body had stopped doing. The waiting list for a deceased donor kidney in Ohio ran 5 to 7 years. Dialysis was sustainable, but degrading. It kept him alive while slowly, systematically reducing the quality of that life. He called to Thomas on a Thursday evening in October 2014. Thomas was in his kitchen when the call came. Patricia was in the next room. The children were grown and out of the house. It was an ordinary Thursday evening, with nothing particular to distinguish it from the thousands of ordinary Thursday evenings that had preceded it. Daniel's voice was quieter than usual. The charm was present, but subdued, the way a skilled performer adjusts their register to match the emotional weight of the scene they are playing. He explained the diagnosis. He explained what dialysis involved. He described the waiting list with the tone of a man who had accepted a terrible arithmetic. 5 to 7 years, 3 sessions a week, and a body that was slowly losing the argument with its own failure. Then he described living donor transplantation. He had done his research. He explained the compatibility requirements. He explained that siblings had the highest statistical likelihood of compatibility. He explained what a successful transplant would mean. Not just the years it would add, but the quality of those years, the freedom from the machine, the return to something that resembled normal life. He asked Thomas if he would consider being tested. Thomas said yes before Daniel finished the sentence. Patricia heard it from the next room. She came to the kitchen doorway. Thomas looked at her and said, Daniel was sick and he was going to be tested. She nodded. There was no discussion that night about whether this was the right decision. Thomas had already made it. The compatibility testing came back positive. Surgery was scheduled for March 14, 2015, at the Cleveland Clinic. Thomas would donate his left kidney. The medical team explained the procedure. Laparoscopic donor nephrectomy, 2 to 3 hours under general anesthesia, 1 to 2 nights in the hospital, 4 to 6 weeks of recovery, during which physical exertion would need to be limited. The risks were real but statistically modest. For a healthy man in his mid-40s with no complicating conditions, the procedure was considered safe. Thomas read every document they gave him. He asked the appropriate questions. He signed the consent forms without delay. The night before the surgery, Thomas, Patricia, and Daniel had dinner at the house on Mercer Street. Daniel had driven up from Atlanta. He was warm that evening in the complete way he could be. Present, funny, grateful in a manner that felt genuine, because it probably was genuine. Whatever Daniel was capable of feeling, he felt it that night. He sat at his mother's kitchen table and ate the meal Patricia had made and talked about their childhoods and laughed at the right moments. Thomas's son Marcus came by briefly. He hugged his uncle. Renee called from Boston to check in. It was the kind of evening that families have at significant moments. The gathering before the change, the meal before the surgery, the ordinary made ceremonial by what surrounds it. Thomas went to bed at 10 o'clock. He had to be at the hospital at 5:30. He had no reason to suspect anything. He had known Daniel for 42 years. He had loaned him money twice and been repaid both times. He had accepted his limitations and built a relationship around the reality of who his brother was. He had said yes without calculation to a request that asked him to give a piece of himself permanently and irreversibly. He went to sleep in his own bed on the night of March 13th, 2015, with nothing but goodwill toward his brother in his chest. Surgery began at 7:15 a.m. on March 14th. The procedure went as planned. By 10:40 a.m., Thomas's left kidney had been removed, transferred, and was functioning in his brother's body. Thomas was moved to the recovery ward, sedated and monitored, his body beginning the process of adjusting to the absence of an organ it had relied on for 46 years. By 4 p.m. that same afternoon, Daniel Greer called a real estate attorney in Cleveland. The buyer had been identified 6 weeks earlier. The negotiations had been conducted throughout February and the first 2 weeks of March. The agreed sale price was $218,000. The closing had been scheduled, at Daniel's specific request, for March 15th, the day after the surgery. The power of attorney that Thomas had signed in January 2014, during a period when he had been dealing with a separate estate matter and Daniel had offered to assist with paperwork, had been retained by Daniel for 14 months. Its original purpose had been narrow, to allow Daniel to sign certain documents related to their mother's estate during a period when Thomas was managing a heavy workload. It had been used once for its stated purpose and then, by all appearances, filed away. Daniel had not filed it away. He presented it to the real estate attorney on March the 15th, 2015. He signed the sale documents on Thomas's behalf. He transferred the title. He received a cashier's check for $218,000. Not his half share, the full amount, the entire value of the house on Mercer Street. He deposited the check into an account that Thomas had no access to and no knowledge of. He was on a flight to Miami that afternoon. Thomas was in the hospital, eating his first full meal since the surgery, still processing the physical reality of what his body had just undergone, still believing that his brother had driven back to Atlanta. Patricia found out 4 days later. She had gone to Mercer Street to retrieve some items Thomas had asked for during his hospital stay. A sweater, a book, a specific pair of shoes he wanted for his return home. She found new locks on the front door. She found a real estate company notice affixed to the door indicating the property was under new ownership. She found, when she called the real estate company, that the sale had closed on March 15th and the buyer had taken possession. She drove to the Cleveland clinic. She sat beside Thomas's bed. She told him what she had found. Thomas Greer lay in a hospital bed 4 days after donating a kidney to his brother, and understood that the house where his mother had died and his children had celebrated birthdays and the oak tree his father had planted in 1968 was gone. His brother had taken it while he was unconscious. The first response was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. It was disorientation, the specific cognitive failure that occurs when reality presents information that no available framework can accommodate. Thomas asked Patricia to check again. She had. He asked her to call the real estate company directly. She did from the hospital room, and the representative confirmed the sale, confirmed the date, confirmed the new owner's name. Thomas asked her to call Daniel. Daniel did not answer. He did not answer that day, or the next, or the 3 days after that. His voicemail filled up. His Atlanta apartment, Patricia discovered through a call to the building's management office, had been vacated on March the 10th, 4 days before the surgery. He had cleaned out his apartment 4 days before receiving his brother's kidney. He had been already gone before Thomas went under. The physical recovery from donor nephrectomy requires the body to compensate for a missing organ. The remaining kidney expands its function gradually, taking on the workload of 2. Under ordinary circumstances, for a healthy patient, in a stable environment, this process proceeds without significant complication. Under circumstances involving acute psychological trauma, chronic sleep disruption, and the kind of sustained cortisol release that comes from a profound and incomprehensible loss, the process is not ordinary. Thomas developed elevated blood pressure within 2 weeks of discharge. He lost 14 pounds over the following 6 weeks. His doctor flagged the weight loss, asked about his stress levels, made notes in his file. Thomas told him there had been a family situation. He did not elaborate. He went back to work at 6 weeks because he needed the structure, and because sitting at home gave him nothing to do but think. He performed his job adequately. He spoke to his colleagues with normal courtesy. He attended the meetings he was required to attend. He went home in the evenings and sat. Patricia described this period in testimony as watching her husband become a smaller version of himself. Not through breakdown, not through visible collapse, through a steady compression of whatever it was that had made him large in her understanding of him. His willingness to be fully present, his comfort with openness, the quality of ease that had always surrounded him in his own home. She watched all of that contract, slowly and without drama, into something guarded and interior that she had not seen in him before and did not fully recognize. He had one conversation with Sandra. She listened. She said she was not surprised. She described Daniel in terms that were more accurate than forgiving. Thomas found this both helpful and completely inadequate as a response to what had happened to him. He consulted an attorney in April 2015, a civil litigator in downtown Cleveland named Grace Park, who specialized in family property disputes. She listened to the full account. She reviewed the power of attorney document. She was quiet for a moment before she spoke. She told Thomas that the case was viable but complicated. The power of attorney was a legitimate document. Thomas had signed it. Its misuse, the application of it to a transaction far outside its intended scope, in a context where the grantor was physically incapacitated, was a matter of intent, and proving intent in a civil case required documentation and time. She told him to be prepared for a long process. It was longer than she anticipated. Daniel contested jurisdiction from Florida. The motions and countermotions through 2015 and 2016 accumulated into a procedural weight that slowed the case to a pace that felt, to Thomas, like institutional indifference. Every filing felt like a year. Every delay felt like a second theft. Not of money or property this time, but of the fixed and finite quantity of his remaining life. He turned 50 in 2018. His son Marcus married in 2019. His daughter Renee finished her master's degree in 2020. Life continued at its normal pace in all the ways that it continues regardless of what you are carrying. Thomas attended these events. He was present at them. But something in his presence had changed, and the people who knew him well enough could feel the absence at the center of it. He passed the house on Mercer Street once, in the summer of 2017, while taking a different route home. A family he did not know had put a swing set in the backyard. He did not drive that way again. Part 4. The Turning Point. Civil discovery began in earnest in 2019. This is the phase of litigation where both parties are required to produce documents, financial records, and communications relevant to the case. It is the phase that separates cases built on testimony from cases built on evidence. Thomas's attorney, Grace Park, had been building toward this phase for 4 years. She had been specific and systematic in her document requests. She wanted Daniel's financial records for the 18 months surrounding the surgery. She wanted his communications with the real estate company. She wanted his bank records. She wanted his phone records. Daniel's attorneys had spent 4 years delaying the production of these materials through procedural challenges. When the discovery order came through with a court deadline and consequences for non-compliance, the materials were produced. Grace Park spent 3 days reviewing them. The financial records showed that the $218,000 from the house sale had been deposited into a personal account in Daniel's name at a Florida bank on March 16, 2015, the day after the closing. The account had been opened in January 2015, 2 months before the surgery. It was an account Thomas had no knowledge of and no connection to. The real estate communications were more significant. The email correspondence between Daniel and the buyer's agent showed that negotiations had begun in January 2015. By early February, the price had been agreed in principle. The timeline for closing had been discussed in a series of emails throughout February. In one email, sent by Daniel on February 28, 2015, 13 days before the surgery, Daniel had written to the agent, "We need to close no later than March 15th. I have a prior commitment on the 14th that will keep me occupied for most of the day." His prior commitment on March 14th was receiving his brother's kidney. He had scheduled the closing of the fraudulent house sale for the day after the surgery to give him the maximum possible window of Thomas's incapacitation. He had coordinated the two events, the medical procedure and the financial theft, as components of a single plan. Grace Park presented this email to Thomas in her office on a Tuesday morning. Thomas read it twice. Then he put it on her desk and looked at the window for a long time. He said, "He planned it before the surgery." She said, "Yes." He said, "He planned it while I was being tested for compatibility." She said, "The timeline suggests the real estate process began around the same time as the medical consultations." Thomas was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "He needed me to say yes." This was the understanding that the email produced. Daniel had not made an impulsive decision. He had not seen an opportunity and acted on it in the moment. He had identified a plan, required Thomas's participation in the surgery to make it operational, and cultivated that participation through 42 years of a relationship designed, even if not consciously, to produce the outcome where Thomas would say yes without hesitation. The surgery was not separate from the theft. It was part of the same transaction. This realization did not make Thomas angrier. It made him quieter. The anger had been present for years. This was something different. a colder, more complete understanding of what had actually happened to him and what he had been in Daniel's calculation from the very beginning. The civil trial was scheduled for September 2021. It had been 6 years since the surgery. Thomas was 53 years old. His hair had gone fully gray in the years since. Grace Park had been his attorney for the entire duration. The trial lasted 4 days. Grace Park presented the evidence in sequence. The power of attorney, its intended scope versus its actual use, the real estate timeline, the February 28th email, the financial records showing the account opened in January 2015, the deposit made the day after closing. Daniel's attorneys argued that the power of attorney had been general in its language, that Thomas had understood its scope when he signed it, and that the sale of jointly owned property was within its authority. They argued that the timing of the sale was coincidental to the surgery rather than coordinated with it. The February 28th email made the coincidence argument unsustainable. The judge in the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas, the Honorable Patricia Weston, delivered her verdict on September 23, 2021. She found in favor of Thomas Greer on all primary counts. Her written opinion stated that the evidence demonstrated Daniel Greer had exceeded the scope of the power of attorney, that the transaction constituted civil fraud, and that the coordination of the sale timeline with the donor surgery established intent beyond what could be explained by coincidence or misunderstanding. She awarded Thomas $218,000 in compensatory damages, the full value of the house, not the half share. Her reasoning was that the entire transaction was fraudulent and that Daniel had no legitimate authority to conduct any sale, not merely an excess authority in the portion he retained. She awarded an additional $85,000 in punitive damages, noting the premeditated nature of the betrayal, the exploitation of the plaintiff's temporary incapacitation, and the use of a relationship of trust as the instrument of harm. Total judgment, $303,000. Daniel did not have $303,000. His import business in Miami had generated modest returns and then contracted. His financial position in 2021 was considerably weaker than it had been in 2015, when he had walked away with $200,000 and built a new life on top of it. The life had not held. The court approved a structured payment plan over 7 years. Daniel would pay Thomas in monthly installments. The payments would continue until 2028. Outside the courthouse, Thomas gave a brief statement to a reporter from the Cleveland Plain dealer. He said the house was gone. He said the years were gone. He said no judgment restored either of those things. He said the verdict mattered, not because of the money, but because the record was now correct. In 2020, while the civil case was still pending, the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office had opened a criminal investigation based on the discovery materials produced during the civil litigation. The February 28th email had been shared with the prosecutor's office by Grace Park. In 2022, Daniel Greer was charged with 1 count of theft by deception and 1 count of misuse of power of attorney. He retained a criminal defense attorney in Ohio. In March 2023, he pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of theft by deception. He received 3 years of probation and a court order to continue the civil judgment payments. He served no prison time. Thomas was asked about this in the newspaper interview. He said he had sat with the guilty plea for several days. He had expected something from it. He was not sure what. Relief, perhaps, or the specific closure that people describe when a long fight reaches its formal end. He said what he felt was mostly exhaustion. He said the moment that came closest to what he had been waiting for was not in a courtroom, and not in an attorney's office. It was during a routine medical appointment in 2022. His doctor was reviewing his file and noted, as doctors do in annual reviews, that he was a kidney donor. The doctor asked how the recipient was doing. Thomas told him the full story. His doctor was quiet. Then he said, "The kidney is still functioning. Your brother is alive because of you. That is yours, regardless of what he took." Thomas said he thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. He said it was the first thing anyone had said to him in 8 years that felt like it was about what he had given, rather than what had been taken. There is no clean resolution here. That needs to be said directly, without softening. The house on Mercer Street is gone. The oak tree Thomas's father planted in 1968 belongs to another family now. The bedroom where Evelyn Greer died, the kitchen where the Sunday dinners were made, the backyard where Thomas's children played and knew their grandmother. None of that was returned by the verdict. Property law does not have a mechanism for restoring the meaning that a place holds. It can only address the monetary value of the structure and the land. The 8 years that Thomas spent in litigation are gone. 8 years of birthdays and holidays and ordinary evenings that were conducted under the weight of an unresolved wrong. 8 years of legal fees and depositions and delays, and the particular exhaustion of fighting an institution, even a just one, for what should never have been taken. The relationship between two brothers, whatever it was across 42 years, and whatever it might have been across the years that followed, is permanently gone. Not in the sense of an estrangement that time and effort might repair, but in the more complete sense of a thing that has been examined from every angle and found to have been, at some fundamental level, not what it appeared to be. These losses are not compensated by a judgment. This is not a criticism of the court's decision. The judgment was correct and appropriate. But correctness and restoration are different categories, and it is important not to confuse them. What this story asks us to sit with is the specific discomfort of a betrayal that required love as its precondition. Daniel did not steal from a stranger. He did not identify Thomas as a target through calculation. He grew up in the same house, ate at the same table, borrowed money and repaid it, and maintained enough of the texture of a real relationship that Thomas could not see, perhaps could not allow himself to see, what he was also capable of. He needed Thomas to say yes. And he knew Thomas would say yes because Thomas was the kind of person who says yes, who gave without calculating, who built his entire life around the unglamorous, daily work of being present and reliable and fully available to the people he loved. That quality, that specific form of character, was what Daniel used. This is the part of the story that is hardest to receive. Not the fraud, not the legal maneuvering, not even the fact that Daniel planned the theft, while Thomas was being tested for organ compatibility. The hardest part is this. The betrayal was only possible because Thomas was good. If Thomas had been guarded, transactional, protective of his assets, unwilling to give without a contract, he would have been safe. The power of attorney would never have been signed. The kidney question would have been answered differently, or at least more slowly, with more conditions attached. The house would have been formally protected through legal documentation long before 2015. He would have been safe, and he would have been a different person entirely. There is a version of the lesson from this story that is practical and specific and genuinely useful. Document everything with family. Use formal agreements. Do not sign documents without understanding their full scope. Keep financial and legal matters separate from emotional ones. even when the emotional relationship feels like sufficient protection. All of this is true and worth taking seriously. But underneath that practical lesson is a harder one that the practical lesson cannot fully contain. The people most capable of harming you are the people you have already decided are safe. Not because they are entirely bad, not because the warmth between you was entirely fabricated. Daniel Greer was a real brother in enough of the ways that matter, that Thomas had 42 years of evidence for the relationship before the surgery. He was also capable of planning a theft around that surgery in the weeks before it happened. Both of these things are simultaneously true about the same person. This is the part that people find most difficult to accept about betrayal by family. The requirement that you hold two incompatible truths about the same person, that they were real to you, and that they were also capable of this. The mind wants to resolve the contradiction. Either the warmth was always false, which would mean Daniel was a predator who ran a decades-long con on his brother, which is simpler, but probably not accurate. Or the theft was an aberration, a moment of desperation, a departure from his true character, something that does not define the whole, which is also simpler and also probably not accurate. The truthful answer, which is less comfortable than either of these, is that Daniel Greer contained both things, the genuine warmth and the genuine capacity for this. People are not simple enough for the clean resolution to work. Thomas Greer gave his brother a kidney. That organ is still functioning. It filters Daniel's blood. It keeps him alive. There is no metaphor available that adequately addresses the fact that the person who stole Thomas's childhood home is walking around on Thomas's organ. No framing makes that feel right. It simply is what it is. The permanent, irreversible record of what Thomas gave and what it cost him. What Thomas has, 9 years after the surgery and 8 years after the theft and 3 years after the verdict, is a correct record, a structured payment schedule, a wife who did not leave, children who call regularly, and a life that was not destroyed by what happened to it, even though it was permanently changed. He does not drive past Mercer Street, not out of continuing grief, he has said, but because the grief is finished. Because the house stopped being his house on March 15, 2015, and there is nothing on that street now that has anything to do with the life he lived there. The memories belong to him. The street belongs to whoever lives on it. In the 2023 newspaper interview, the reporter asked Thomas whether he regretted donating the kidney. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I made the decision I would make again. That's not the same as saying, I don't wish things were different." He said, "I know what I am." Daniel knew what I was too. That's how he did it. He said, "But what I am is what I get to keep." The reporter noted that Thomas seemed, at that moment, neither bitter nor resolved. That he seemed like a man who had arrived at an accurate understanding of a situation that had no good version, and had decided to live inside that accuracy, rather than inside a story that made it more bearable but less true. This is not the ending most people want from a story about betrayal. Most people want the betrayer destroyed. They want the victim restored. They want justice that is proportionate and complete and visible. What actually happened is smaller and more real than that. A man gave his brother the organ that keeps him alive. His brother took everything else he could reach. 8 years later, a court said, "That was wrong. Here is a number that represents how wrong." And Thomas Greer, 60 years old, gray-haired, 1 kidney, The house on Mercer Street permanently gone. Looked at the judgment and the payment schedule and the guilty plea and said, "The record is correct now." That is what justice looked like. Not restoration, not destruction, not catharsis. A correct record. Some wrongs cannot be undone. They can only be accurately named. And sometimes that is the most that the world can offer. And sometimes, for the people who survive long enough to receive it, it is enough. This has been Untold Wrongs. Thomas Greer gave his brother a kidney. His brother took everything else he could reach while Thomas was unconscious. 8 years in court produced a judgment, a guilty plea, and a correct record. The house on Mercer Street is gone. The record is not. If this story stayed with you, share it. Subscribe for a new story every week. Real betrayals, real consequences, untold wrongs. Until next time.